Hi, this is Small Talk by Scoperta. I am Alessandra, and today we are hosting two great guests. So let me welcome and introduce quickly Eric Evans. Hi, Eric.
Hi,
And
Alessandra.
Marco Hiemeshoff. Hi,
Hi,
Marco.
Sandra.
So thanks both for accepting our invite. And before we get started, just a quick reminder for people watching this video. This is a live stream, so you can interact with Eric and Marco during the conversation using the chat. So just drop us some questions and comments or insight during the conversation, and we will have an eye on it. Well, I'll pass it to Marco and enjoy the conversation.
Thank you so much, Alessandra, and very much welcome, Eric. So, Eric Evans is the author of the book Domain Driven Design, hardly needs introduction in this channel, I think, and also the author of the Strategic Design for Today's Software Teams workshop at Kandinsky at the end of October. So, Eric, I would like to know, what are you working on these days? What sparks your interest in these times?
Well, I mean, what I find most interesting these days, as many people probably have heard me say, is the Gen AI and all the technology around that. I think that my basic interest in complexity in software uh, and the use of language in software, and now all of a sudden, we have these AI language models that are like the most complex. They're a wonderful new thing, so fascinating. It remains to be seen just exactly how we use them, but as an intellectual thing, it's the most interesting thing to me for many, many years.
Okay, so when you talk about generative AI, I mean, it helps with coding a lot. We've seen vibe coding rising in the last 2 years. But how does generative AI help with strategic design? Does it even
Um,
at all?
well, I don't know if it helps with strategic. Well, it may. I would say the other way around. I would say that strategic design could help a lot with using. So, one thing that interests me, of course, all this using the AI to generate code, all that is important, and I do that. Uh, but I think that incorporating the AI components directly into the software is what really fascinates me. The possibility that we will have, systems with AI components in them. And I don't think that these systems will be entirely AI. It's not going to replace conventional software. It's going to
Mm,
blend into it in some way that we don't quite know yet. That's my speculation, pure speculation. But
yeah.
anyway, when you're going to mix together different kinds of software like that, then some of the strategic design patterns, the bounded context start to come to mind where I mean, it seems quite clear to me that that's a tool we'll need. Uh, Staying focused on our core domain and having a clear understanding of what we're working with there helps to keep people grounded. And I think that those tools, which have been the main strategic design tools since the start, they apply just as much to a system that would have some AI elements mixed into it.
Yeah. I think this is like socio-technical gets a completely new meaning when you have something that is social and technical at the same time. So, talking about integrating AI into context maps, did you see any change or drift in the last 20 years in the use of context maps and bounded contexts? So, if teams started using that, what has changed in the last 2 decades?
20 years is a long time. And at the end
Yeah.
of that 20, at the beginning of that 20 years, it was a relatively new thing that at least no one had a word for. So, yes, there's been a lot of change. I would say that it went through different phases. In the early days of DDD, people were really focused on the tactical stuff. And then after a few years, more attention came to the strategic design part, which was good. And the sophistication of that has, I think, generally grown over the years. There was a big milestone was when microservices came out that did two things. One, it greatly increased awareness of bounded context as a concept. And another thing that happened was that we had this physical embodiment sort of a bounded context where you could really sort of point to a thing and say, that thing there is a bounded context. And I think there were some nuances that were missing in that kind of explanation, but it was helpful. And I think it was really helpful to teams trying to do it too, because it's such a difficult discipline to maintain. So if you have some sort of, physical, I say physical in quotes because obviously it's software, but, if you have something that you can interact with, then it really does make it easier for the team. That's probably the biggest thing. But another thing is like we keep having, it keeps getting incorporated into like, event storming pays a lot of attention to looking for bounded contexts. And so I would say, yeah, it's changed a lot, and 20 years is hard to sum up.
Yeah, that's a very broad question. Let me specify a little. So there's a discrepancy, or there's a difference between the discovery phase and the design phase. Do you usually, when you work on complex domains, start with the design phase deliberately, or is it more of a continuation from discovery into design with strategic design?
So can you elaborate on what you mean by the discovery phase?
If you're going into a legacy company, if you're in a company with a legacy system and you're trying to discover what the bounded contexts are, figure out how to apply strategic design and what the most valuable focus points would be, you are first discovering the domain, and then you're designing a system how it should be, right? So there's a transition from uncovering the hidden gems of the legacy and the organizational legacy that's there until you get to a strategic design. So how do you go about? Do you use different methods for the discovery and the design, or is it one conglomeration of the same tools?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I am not very sequential in the work that I do. So what I mean is that I would be doing both of those things more or less at the same time. And well, maybe not at the same hour, there might be an hour where we would be really focused on what would our ideal design look like, and an hour when we would be focused entirely on what does the system as it exists now look like, and more time devoted to how can we make our ideal system, or an approximation to our ideal system, practical within the existing system. So all of those things are happening sort of iteratively, right? Because at the very start, although people think that they know what their existing system is, but usually their knowledge of that is incomplete.
Yeah.
And definitely they don't know what the new thing really ought to be. A good project goes in with a pretty clear idea, and yet, how it goes with a lot of projects, it ends up somewhere quite different. Or even if it does end up with the essence of the original intention, it's still that their understanding of how to do it changes so much. So yeah, I think those two things have to kind of iterate together. And one of the things that people, I think, underestimate is the difficulty of changing existing systems, so that the discovery aspect of what you're saying, the sketching out the contexts as they exist, And making sure that your new design can coexist with that is really important. Um, People can, this is part of the strategy, people can put themselves in a position where they can't win if they pick a bad strategy. A bad strategy might be a design that isn't friendly to the existing system.
Yeah. When you talk about systems here, do you speak about the technical systems or the organizational systems? Like, what do you apply strategic design on?
Now, my primary focus is the technical system, the software, but you can't ignore the social system around it. The organization is definitely part of that. So, like, if we do the context mapping technique, which I can't explain fully in this conversation, but it does kind of blend those two concerns. It's primarily a description of the system as it exists, of where there are different models, different sort of systems of language and concepts, and how they exchange information.
Mhm.
But in those relationships is another layer, which is like the communication of the teams that are responsible for these things, or even the power dynamics of those teams. So that, you might say, oh, this new design would be fairly easy to do if we can just have this other team make a relatively easy change to their system. And so now, well, a relatively easy change sounds practical, but that practicality depends on the idea that that other team will be in any way motivated to make that change, or that they will be allowed to within the constraints that they operate under.
Yeah.
And so, without any awareness of the team dynamics and those kind of, yeah, I mean, it is really, in a sense, one system, right? You have to operate within that system, and your strategy has to somehow give you a path from where you are to some place you'd like to be. You can't just pick your ideal design and head for that. It just may not be a reachable thing.
So how do you iterate on these strategic design decisions when you help a team, for example, as a consultant? Do you start from a strategy that comes from within a single team? Do you always take like a holistic approach and bring multiple teams together? What is your favorite or most usual approach on that?
Well, usually it starts with a single team that's been tasked with doing something we hope would have some uh, strategic significance. So, another aspect to strategy is you ought to be doing something that will actually make a noticeable difference in the business. So, if you
Mhm.
are, if you're doing something that at the end they succeed and then no one really notices, then that's a strategic failure of another kind. So you start with a team that's been assigned to do something like that. And I usually will work from that point of view quite a bit because those people have a lot of knowledge about the part of the organization that they have to interact with. So if they're integrating with other systems that are controlled by different teams, they'll know quite a bit about that. And so we can go a ways down the path. We can start to, I mentioned you can't just pick an ideal design and expect that thing to exist, but you can sometimes build a very simple prototype. So, we can start processes that will help make sure that we understand the actual problem that we've been assigned, that the concept of the solution we're supposed to build actually works. And those things can go on even very early in a project. I like to get things going really early before we really have enough knowledge to make them
Mhm.
work. So you almost know that the first things you do are going to have to be redone because there's almost surely something that you did not understand well enough. It might be that you didn't understand some aspect of the problem, so the design just doesn't handle certain important cases, or it could be that you didn't understand the relationship to the other systems well enough. And now we have to rethink this because it depends too much on something we have no control over, or all kinds of things can happen. So you're in a better position if you dive in fast because you start gaining knowledge. You have to, you know, domain driven design is all about the knowledge. You pick the process that will build the team's knowledge the fastest. Sometimes that's the
Mhm.
top priority, because once the team has enough knowledge, they can start making good strategies. So at the beginning, you almost figure whatever we do is going to be a blunder. Let's make it not be too costly a blunder. um,
Yeah.
let's get into some kind of iterative loop that starts giving us feedback. Those are my priorities at the beginning.
Yeah, it sounds like learning fast as a priority in that case. Do
Yeah.
you have something like the DDD Whirlpool also for strategic design? So far, I've been only using it as a tactical tool, but do you have an updated map for that?
I guess I think that you can, the same basic principle applies. It does sort of describe an iterative loop between,
Hmm.
it's true that the whirlpool is more focused on your tactical modeling within a bounded context. It's like, okay, explore the model, do some prototypes, and refine it, and so on. But yeah, what would the equivalent be? I've never drawn a diagram of that. I think that definitely, though, there is that kind of activity going on. It is a little different in the sense that the degree that I expect the overall thing to change is a lot less. I'm much more now, and this is a thing where other people could be better at certain things than I am. But generally speaking, I think projects are more likely to succeed when they have a modest uh, view of how much they can change the existing
Yeah.
uh, systems, including the technical and the social systems. You know, those are hard to change. And if you can find a good solution that operates more or less within the existing framework, uh, and if that really isn't possible, identify that early so that you can start to challenge that status quo before too much investment is put into a strategy that won't work. There are a lot of strategies that simply will not work. And the quicker you can recognize that and then pivot, the better. So, but to answer your question, no, I've never made such a diagram. It would be a bit different, I guess. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I would like to talk about the workshop, but before that, I have a question from the audience, Xin Zhao. She asks, connecting pure speculation of AI with core domain thinking, how would you imagine AI's compatibility with core supporting and generic subdomains in the near and far future?
That is a great question. I think about stuff like that a lot. So one thing I will say, you asked me earlier what's changed over the time, and one thing I think I have changed on a little bit is that I used to emphasize always how important it was to stay focused on the core domain and not get distracted. And I still, of course, still that is essential. But I think I have come to appreciate generic subdomains more. So
Mhm.
what I mean there, especially if there's some kind of fairly separable concern that may be broadly, that's encountered a lot. And if we can improve our way of handling that, it takes some of the burden off of the other of our exploration of the core domain. So the more generic subdomains we peel away and really master with good libraries and things, the more unburdened we are. Now, the reason I mention that now is because, in a way, right now we're trying to learn to use these AI tools. And one way that I find helpful, and I do this sometimes in side projects and occasionally in real projects, uh, is I'll attack a generic subdomain with a new tool. Like yet another library for time. I've done a number of those, most of which I've never bothered to, you know, trouble the outside world with. But exploring those is a great way to get a feel for how this new technique will really work, whether you're trying a different style of programming. Like for a while, I was really into what would tactical DDD look like in functional programming. That, and I found, by the way, that it was a really nice fit, and it looked interestingly different, but recognizable. So anyway, the point is, though, the best place to explore things like that is usually a generic subdomain where the stakes aren't quite so high as they are in the core domain, where the where you have a good starting point of understanding, right? You don't need to learn as much about the domain. Now, that said, because right now we're very early days with this, I think that's really useful for when we're in this early stage. I think that the big opportunities are the core domain. When people really have mastered these techniques, we're going to find ways to apply uh, AI to the core domain in useful ways. Right now, that's tricky because, well, among other things, the reliability of such systems. You, when you get into that core domain where things by their nature are less predictable usually anyway,
Yeah.
I think sometimes you want to lower risk and use more conventional techniques, but certainly as we master the techniques, then it'll be applied to, I suppose, to all of those areas. Now, by the way, I think maybe the biggest area right now might be the supporting domains, because if you think about what vibe coding does, well, actually, I've been experimenting with trying to produce code that's as good as what I would produce by hand. And I think it can be done with like a lot more attention than what the word vibe coding to me suggests something a little more hands off, and maybe something where you're not too concerned about those nuances of code that we often obsess about. And one area where that's true is sometimes with the what we call the supporting domains, which is like all that stuff that has to be there and has to run, but it isn't the stuff that will make or break. Like it has to be correct, but it doesn't have to be constantly iterated because we're in an arms race like a core domain sometimes is. And
Yeah.
it may not have the conceptual elegance that a generic subdomain might have, because we all have thought about it for so long. We've separated it out and it's got this very evolved, mature model. It's like this scrappy stuff that's left over that we do need. It has to be correct, but we're not going to evolve it. Once it works well enough. And I suppose vibe coding is perfect for that. You can crank out, that even in the earlier kind of generating code generation approaches, that was the best area to apply those, I think. And so that style of vibe coding, I think, works well. The other style of vibe coding, if it is vibe coding, is like where you really are collaborating with this thing to produce elegant designs. That, of course, could be used anywhere.
Yeah. Thank you for this very thorough answer. If you want to dive
Sorry,
deeper
I
into
go
this,
on, but
no, that's
sometimes
totally
you
fine.
tap into something that I've actually been
Yeah, yeah.
thinking about, And then I can't help myself. Sorry.
You said earlier that this is one of your core focus points at the moment, the exploration of generative AI in the context of complex software development. We will have an open space session together with Eric and Renat Abdulin and some others at the Kandinsky. So join us there if you want to go hands-on with this for a longer period of time. But now to talk about your workshop, the strategic design for software teams, what can participants expect to learn and experience during the 2-day workshop that you devised? What do you hope for this participants will discover that they might not get from books or talks alone?
Well, I hope that they will, first of all, if people haven't read it or don't have any background, they'll get those basic concepts. So it is starting from, it assumes a person has some real experience in the field of software, because without that, a lot of these techniques just seem pointless and hard to grasp. But assuming they have that kind of experience, they'll learn those basic principles. But then the people who already know those principles, I hope, will get more of a tangible feeling. One of the things we do in there is we go through an example in depth, so that people can see, like, how might the shift in dynamics affect bounded context. How do we, there's a lot of emphasis on the pre-existing bounded context, the ones that are in the system that you can't do much about. That they'll get the core domain and how a shift in the core domain, like a shift in the company's strategy, might translate into a shift in your software strategy. Those kind of things in the form of a concrete example. And there's a lot of discussion. It's a very discussion-oriented class. So we're keeping it very small. Like the limit, I think we set was 12. So, and I don't know how many will actually be there, but it's small enough, partly because it is a very discussion-oriented, interactive kind of thing.
So given that scope, who is that workshop for? Like, who is your desired target audience? What level of experience do they bring from strategic design in general or software development in general?
They need to have some experience with software development on, some kind of real project, or else they just, or that kind of organizational stuff that you sort of have to experience to even get. But that tends to sweep in your architects, your project managers, your senior developers, and product owners. Product owners used to be pretty big in that class. But yeah, I suppose architects are we get a lot of architects for the strategic design class. Product owners tend to enjoy it. And then, anyone who's been around a little bit, I don't mean 20 years, I mean, like, but have been through a real project, that will do it.
Okay, so then last question from my side. What prior misunderstandings about domain-driven design do you most enjoy to unlearn people or participants?
Oh, I think that how basic my definition of model really is. So that when I put up the definition and I say it's a system of abstractions, and that's the whole definition that I found in some 100-year-old dictionary, I think that there's a lot that comes out of that. If you reduce it to a UML diagram or one of a dozen other things I've seen people reduce it to, then you end up reducing bounded context to a microservice, and your model's reduced to entities and value objects. So if you can break away from that and really think about systems of abstractions, the concepts evolving, and all that would follow from that, and then the connection to language kind of emerges, that's the most fundamental level of DDD, I think.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. So Eric, any final thoughts for the audience? Anything important we haven't covered that you'd like to mention before we finish?
I think you've covered a lot of interesting things. I'm looking forward to the conference, to the workshop, and to all the things at the conference proper. I'll be going to lots of sessions, and so
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much then.
thank you.
That covers today. Alessandra, you're on mute. Like in a proper online session, somebody's on mute.
So thank you both, Eric and Marco, for sharing your perspective and for your time today. And yes, for the audience, we'll still have some available seats for your workshop in Berlin. So for anyone who wants to join, they can just you can just drop us an email or scan the QR code if you are watching the video. Again, thank you so much, and to the next episode.